Hello, and welcome to a special edition of the State of the Fleet Industry video series produced by Automotive Fleet Magazine. And this video series is designed to put a spotlight on key leaders in today's fleet management industry. And today I have the honor to interview Oleg Cytowicz. He's the North American fleet lead for Unilever North America, and he's a 31-year veteran of the fleet industry. So with that, thank you for joining us, Oleg.
Mike, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, our pleasure. So let's start our discussion by trying to tap into your wealth of experience that you have in the fleet industry. And in particular, I'd like to examine fleet technology, how it's evolved. You got started in the industry in 1989. Could you briefly describe to us what was the state of the art in the way of fleet technology in the early to mid 1990s?
Oh, I'd be happy to. It's actually going to be pretty eye-opening to a lot of people and quite humorous to some of us old-timers out there. But my primary role when I was hired by Lever Brothers back in the day as the automotive fleet clerk was to process all of the data submitted by our drivers through expense reports receipts. And I was responsible for collecting all of these slips and processing the data, the mileage information, onto 5 1/4 floppy inch disk drives on an old IBM PC. And that information was then used to project mileage and vehicle replacement projection reports that we used. And it was basically managing thousands of receipts on disks storing thousands of numbers of data to try to figure out when cars were eligible for replacement.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's kind of funny, talking about it now, but back then that was really light years advancement over what fleet management was like in the prior to that in the early 80s and in the 70s.
Yeah, and the reason that I was brought on board is because I had that computer introductory knowledge where they used to actually use graphs, huge graphic charts to write down the mileage reported, and they would just use these huge graph papers to project when these cars were eligible. By having the computer experience, we were able to run the Lotus 1-2-3 software back in the day, which was cutting edge, to generate those projection numbers that we needed to make those determinations. Yeah, it was actually quite groundbreaking in a fleet industry that we were trying to put this together so far back.
And then, so that takes us up to the early 90s. And now if we look at the mid 90s to the late 1990s, the big breakthrough there in terms of fleet technology was the introduction of web-enabled fleet management systems. And I'm wondering if you could take a moment to explain how this transition occurred and how it impacted your fleet management of a fleet like Unilever's.
Yeah, so actually it was a big benefit to us from the fleet side, right? Because this basically ushered in the era of information and knowledge and empowering individuals to go out and do research and get all of the details and all of the data that they needed to come up with decisions on their own. What we did is we embraced the fact that that knowledge was available to our drivers. And what we did from the fleet side is we consolidated all of the knowledge that was required for them to make decisions into one specific link. So we actually consolidated all of this data that was available to our people into one link on our internal website, released it to our drivers, and our drivers were able to go to that link and actually look at the vehicles that we offered on our selector prior to them going out and making their decision on what vehicle they were going to choose for the next 3 years. So what we did is we basically increased the driver's education in helping them make the proper decision for the type of vehicle they needed and saved them a ton of time with running around to dealerships to obtain that type of stuff. So we actually embraced it to try to promote the education of our drivers with what was available to them.
Well, and not only did individual companies such as your own embrace it, but the whole industry embraced it. And when I look back on that era, I'm just really amazed at how quickly our industry really pivoted from desktop computer systems to mainframes, all to a web-based enabled fleet management system. And that transition occurred throughout the industry in less than 5 years. I think the cutting edge companies went on it immediately, and the laggard companies, the last of them, went on 5 years or so later.
Yeah.
And that kind of a transition, wholesale transition within an industry, is really just breathtaking. I can't think of too many industries that make that kind of a dramatic change.
Yeah, I agree, Mike. I mean, and it didn't stop there, right?
Sure.
Technology continued to evolve, right? And the way that the data was presented continued to evolve. And the amount of access to information that people have continued to evolve. And that's not stopping. That's a trend that continues going forward. And I'm kind of looking forward to see what the future has to bring on that side.
Well, because that brings us to the next point. So we've examined what fleet management technology has been like in the 1990s, early 2000s, and around this time during this transition to web-enabled fleet management systems, we had two other huge milestones that occurred in our industry. And the first was the U.S. government opening up GPS signals to private industry. And then second, there was this whole explosion of fleet data due to the implementation of telematics devices in fleet vehicles. So I'm wondering if you could now take a moment to explain, how these two new data streams, and huge data streams that they are, impacted or benefited fleet management.
This is really a cool subject matter, right? Because if you really think about this particular time frame was very definitive on what we as fleet managers are doing in our industries right now and the services that we provide our organizations. I can remember as all of this started ramping up, Mike, right? We know as well as anybody else that the amount of data that was being made available to fleet managers was mind-boggling, right? We were actually almost in panic mode with the fact that there was so much information that we didn't know how to process it, we didn't know how to define it, and we didn't know what to do with it. So from the fleet management perspective, that's where we had to determine what data was most beneficial to our organizations. So fleet management basically evolved into almost a data mining organization where you literally had all of these facts and figures in front of you, and how you deciphered them would be either a benefit or a deterrent to what you're currently doing within your business. So it made us as fleet professionals a lot more accurate with what we were presenting to management. We had more live information, and we could tailor that information to exactly what we needed to do to move our organization either forward or identify areas of opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not only data mining, but it was also data analytics,
Yep.
and I distinguish between the two. The other thing is, this brought about this whole era of data overload. I
Oh, yeah.
remember even before, you had these web-based systems. Fleet managers on a monthly basis would be receiving from their fleet management companies these huge reams of books, on data on the vehicle, and I'd be visiting fleet managers, and they'd have piles of them, stuck at the end of their office because they just didn't have the time to go through everything. Um, so, we're in this era then of data overload. Data analytics is coming to the forefront now in trying to develop and identify that actionable data that's needed. So, in concluding our discussion, I'd like to have you kind of look forward and see where tomorrow's technology is heading and how fleet data might be managed in the future. What's your assessment on that?
Well, as we move forward in this area, Mike, I think that this data that is being presented and coming to light for us is definitely driving different aspects of our industry, right? The telemetric side is driving the safety side, right? We now have numbers and we now have statistics that we can lay foundation to develop our safety programs. And this is hard facts, right? This isn't just numbers that we're contruding or projecting or anything. These is hard facts. So from the safety perspective, I can see that this data, as we progress, is going to drive a lot more safety initiatives within our industry.
Mm-hmm.
Also, autonomous vehicles, man, as this stuff starts to evolve and as this information starts to become more solidified and more accepted, that's going to drive a lot of stuff and possibly a lot of change in the future for the industry as well. I mean, there's just so much available and so many different avenues that we can go down to improve the way we do business. And I'm really looking forward to in the future on how this is going to evolve in simplifying a lot of processes that we currently have.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. Well, that concludes our conversation. We've reached our allotted time. I want to thank you, Oleg, for a terrific conversation, and especially this walkthrough by decade on how fleet technologies evolved. So thank you again for participating.
Oh, my pleasure, Mike. Anytime, more than happy to reminisce, as you want to say. But I just want to say thank you once again. Tell everybody to stay safe and be well.
Okay, thank you.